Well, welcome and good morning to Logic and Reason. We once again gather at the Temple of Wisdom to join battle with conspiracy theorists everywhere. This morning we have a wonderful show lined up for you and some really great guests. We hope you enjoy the show. But first, let me introduce my co-host, Jeff from Steaming Cup of Reason.
Well, hello, everyone. Hello, Logical. Good to be here with you again. As Logical said, we've got a great show lined up for you today. We're going to be talking about anti-vax, that one topic that seems to get under the skin of every medical professional there is. And to start us off, I'd like to introduce our first guest. He himself is a licensed physician and specializes in internal medicine, pain management, and addictions. Bob, the science guy. Bob, say hello.
Well, good morning, gentlemen and ladies.
Hey, good morning, Bob. Is there anything going on in your neck of cyberspace that you want to let everybody know about before we get started?
At this hour of the morning, hell, the birds aren't even awake. All it's doing out there is slowly starting to freeze. We'll be doing that until about April.
Yep, only 4 more months to go until spring. And our next guest has been known to be stomping on stupid in live chats and on Discord, on YouTube premieres left and right, but she is making her first live show voice debut with us today, and we are hugely honored. Linda Bertelson. Welcome, Linda.
Hello.
What's going on with you and Mike over there in your neck of the woods in cyberspace that you want to let anybody in the audience know about?
Oh, not a lot. Mike hopefully will be making a new video. I don't really make videos. I just watch videos.
Yeah, but Linda, in case anybody is unaware, is a licensed physical therapist, and people may be asking, why would we have a physical therapist on to talk about anti-vax? Well, while we were planning the show, I found out that Linda, in the course of her career, has had the opportunity to work with clients who have been injured due to communicable diseases such as polio, and we thought that would be a unique take on the whole anti-vaccine movement that we could explore. So, Amy, our chief mod, is going to be keeping us all in line and overseeing the live chat for us, bringing attention to anything that's going on in the live chat that help drive our conversation forward. She is also the parent of an autistic child who will be weighing in from time to time from that aspect of her expertise during this show. Amy, say hi to everybody.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever time of day it is where you are. And I just want to say thank you to our guests who are coming on today, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
And keeping our stream flowing and keeping us safe from any conspiracy theorist attack that may try to disrupt the stream. We have in the background our chief producer, Teddy Bogle. Teddy, say hi to everybody.
All right, Trips, all right. Good morning, good evening, good night, good whatever the hell time of day it is in this lovely globe of ours. Please do remember to engage in the chat. If you do have any questions, just at Logic and Reason, man. We'll get them sorted for you. And kick back, relax, and enjoy this one. It's going to be an interesting subject, folks.
Thank you, Teddy. And everybody in the live chat, if you have a blue wrench and happen to see a conspiracy theorist wander into the room, that's fine. They can talk about whatever they want to talk about, provided that it is not completely disrespectful. Things such as racist remarks, homophobic remarks, and that kind of stupidity needs to go immediately. Anything else, they can go ahead and spout whatever nonsense they want to spout. If their comments or questions are on point, on topic, we will address them on the show, so we don't censor them unless it's absolutely necessary to keep from getting a community strike on this channel. With that, I'm going to let Bob open up the discussion about anti-vaccine movements, what it means, and the whole bit. Bob, I'll let you get us started.
Well, good morning. You know, the anti-vax movement's always troubled me a great deal. Back in 1955, when they developed the polio vaccine, Dr. Jonas Salk, who developed this vaccine after working in North Africa in the 40s, worked many years to develop this vaccine. The first people that he tested it on were his wife and children. And when they released the vaccination to the general public, initially for a wide-scale test and then for release to the public, parents lined their children up around the block to get vaccinated because polio was the scourge of summer. If you were in elementary school in the, prior to the vaccination days, you would know somebody that had polio. They either died from polio or they were crippled from it. It was a very, very common illness. They would close swimming pools in the summer to try and prevent it. It was just a terrible thing. And as a result of the success of the polio vaccine, we no longer see it. I have, in my entire career since age 19, seen one polio patient. And that was it. I've seen several cases of post-polio syndrome from people that wish that they had had the vaccine. But I've never seen an active polio case myself that was newly diagnosed. I saw one that had been diagnosed in the late 50s, and it was an elderly gentleman. He actually had an iron lung, and I had to transport him to the hospital back when I was a paramedic. The next problem that you would run into is you've got to look at the type of diseases that we vaccinate against, okay? We have diseases that will just simply kill you outright. Polio, meningitis, the smallpox was another one. And then we have diseases that are extremely common and contagious that have a much lower rate of complications, but infect scores, orders of magnitude more than are infected by some of these more serious diseases. An example of those types of diseases would be measles. Now, if you look at the World Health Organization statistics, measles is still extremely common throughout the world because vaccination is not readily available. And prior to vaccinations, over 48,000 people were hospitalized a year for complications of measles in the United States, and about 1 in 20 of those would die. And you still see that in the third world right now. But in areas of the world where you have vaccination against measles, you no longer see any of that. And the only time you see these outbreaks and epidemics is in groups that deliberately choose not to take advantage of the vaccinations that are required. And then the third type of vaccinations that you get are the vaccines that are designed to prevent diseases or for special reasons such as international travel. So one of the things that you can use, there are two ways you can tell the effectiveness of vaccinations. One is in the rate of these diseases, and the second is, believe it or not, in the military. Members of the military are vaccinated against diseases to preserve the fighting strength. And it is designed to keep our military forces healthy. And as a result, vaccinations are required. In many occupations, such as in healthcare, flu vaccines are required because people come to hospitals. You don't want to get them sick when they come to the hospital. And one of the easiest ways to get them sick is have a nurse give them influenza. And we are seeing some controversy right now with that, which we can discuss a little bit later. But basically, the bottom line is I'm a father, my children are vaccinated. I'm vaccinated because I'm in healthcare. And this is not a personal rights issue. This is a public health issue, very much like hand washing at restaurants. Now, surprisingly, if you look at the rates of allergic reactions to hand soaps and dermatitis, your risk of hand washing is actually much higher than your risk from a vaccination. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you.
Wow, that's you brought up a lot of interesting points, but that last one surprises me. I did not know that.
How many people do you know with contact dermatitis or an allergy to jewelry or hand soap or something along the lines like that versus how many people do you personally know that have had an adverse reaction to a vaccination?
Wow, that's one of those things that just, you're right. I do know quite a few people with contact dermatitis, and I just hadn't thought about it. And I'm sure most
latex
anti-vaxxers
gloves.
don't think about it either. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the saving lives aspect. When I know a lot of the hardline conspiracy theorists that are anti-vaxxers talk about, this nonsense of population control. They're trying to kill off or whatever, and it's like, that's ridiculous, because the population isn't going down, it's going up because part of the reason is vaccines are saving lives. And what about you,
Well, let me
Linda?
add one more.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me add one more thing before I hand it over to Linda. On my upper arm, I have a round scar. Any of you guys have one too?
I do. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I do also.
That is a smallpox vaccination. My children do not have that scar. Do you know why my children don't have that scar? Because we have it. And it doesn't exist in the wild anymore. The last known case of smallpox was in a medical photographer in London, England in 1975 who was infected at a research facility. She died. Her mother recovered.
Yeah, I want to come back to that point in a minute. But first, I want to let Linda weigh in with some opening statements of her own.
Okay. Well, my perspective is I agree totally with what Bob said. Being a healthcare professional, I have had to have vaccines, and I have seen the rise of having healthcare professionals making flu vaccines mandatory in hospitals. And I work in skilled nursing facilities. And we're seeing the rise where some facilities are at a point where in order to keep your job, you have to get a flu vaccine. Used to be, if you didn't get a flu vaccine, you'd have to wear a mask the entire flu season. Now there are facilities that tell you you can't work. Also, I have worked with people who are post-polio patients, and anytime you have a childhood disability that prevents you from moving a body part where you have weakness, or you're paralyzed in one part of your body, say one leg or both legs, which is the consequences of polio. As you get older, just like everyone else, it becomes more difficult because you were weaker to begin with. And then as you get older and your body becomes weaker, even that becomes weaker. And so your life becomes even more difficult, and you need more assistance than you did previously. My own experience with vaccines is, as an adult, one of the jobs I recently had applied for, you had to have vaccines because we'd be working with different ages of people. I had to prove that I was immune to different childhood diseases: measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox. And in the course of having that testing done, I discovered I wasn't immune to chickenpox, even though I had them as an infant. So as an adult, I had the chickenpox vaccine. As a child, that was not available to me. We all got the chickenpox.
Yeah, we did. And Jeff, what do you think so far?
Well, I kind of have to agree with both Bob and Linda. Because of the fact that I have been vaccinated, I know that my children are safe. But nowadays, parents are making an unwise choice to not vaccinate unless their child gets sick. And I kind of afraid that that might be too late. Like when I was going through school, that was in the mid 60s. Every child in my school got a barrage of vaccinations. It was mandatory. When I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, I had to go through a mandatory barrage of vaccinations. And then I voluntarily got boosters 16 years ago when I relocated here to Vietnam. I don't think that parents should have the right to not vaccinate their child if they're going to be placing them in a public system where their child are going to be exposing other children to things. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I the last job I had was very similar to Linda's, working in medical facilities. I was working in an addiction recovery program that was located within a homeless shelter. And it was a very interesting setup. But if anybody is unfamiliar with homeless shelters, communicable diseases are rife. Tuberculosis, rubella, influenza is horrible, especially this time of year. And if we as counselors were not vaccinated, we would be sick all winter long, and usually through the spring and occasionally in the summer. You just could not function in your job in that environment and being unvaccinated. But I'd like to come back to that point that Bob made about the smallpox being eradicated in nature. I read that last night, and it kind of made me cross my eyes a minute. I was like, wait a minute. One of the arguments that I typically make when talking to an anti-vaxxer is that polio is still in the natural environment. Measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, influenza, all these things are still in the natural environment. Therefore, we still need to vaccinate against them. But then when I read that, I'm like, well, is that a valid argument? Did we, am I off base there, Bob? Or, how do we know for sure that smallpox won't make a resurgent because it's just kind of hiding under a rock somewhere?
Well, smallpox is actually hiding in labs in the United States and the Soviet Union. That's the Cold War era, me coming out in Russia. So those are the only two remaining stocks of smallpox. And as far as polio, I have the statistics in a presentation I gave a while ago, but I think that there are only 3 countries left that have active cases of polio. All right, and at least 2 of them, as I recall, are in Africa. I think the last case of polio in India occurred years ago, and you don't really see that anymore. And there's an interesting thing going on with polio right now. There are 2 types of vaccinations against polio. One is a killed virus vaccination that's injectable, and that's the Salk vaccine. And then there's an oral polio virus, which is a live but weakened virus. Now, we used to traditionally give the oral virus, which is a better route in the United States. And there was a big battle between Salk and Sabin as far as the safety of their various vaccines. We do actually see some problems, at least on a theoretical basis, and there may have even been a handful of cases worldwide with the oral virus. And as a result, because the risk is so low, the risk from the oral polio virus, even though it's minuscule, was deemed to be too much, and they switched over to the killed virus vaccines in the United States, at least. So, yes, it is something that still needs to be watched out for.
Yeah, I remember getting those pink sugar cubes when I was in grade school for the oral polio vaccine.
When I was in elementary school in 1969, they just freaking lined us up in the gym. I mean, that was that. There wasn't any freaking debate about it. You lined up, you got your shot, you shut up.
Yep, and if I don't recall, I was a child at the time, but I don't think my parents ever signed a parental consent slip for that. That was just something that just happened, and people understood why they were all for it, and no debate.
Well, the problem that you run into right now is, since you're not dealing with gravely ill children and an iron lung, you have time to sit on the internet and fret about polio and fret about vaccinations and gluten.
Yeah. Go ahead, Linda.
I think also when we were children, it was considered more of a public health issue, because most of my vaccinations were done through the school system. Nowadays, all my daughter's vaccinations, although my daughter's 30, but children nowadays and for years, all their vaccinations are done through the pediatrician. I don't remember having any vaccinations done through the pediatrician. I have my shot record that, well, it's not a formal thing that my mother gave me, and everything she gave me, and I remember getting them as a child, was all done through. I remember, just like you did, Bob, going up on getting up on the stage and getting the oral polio. We would sit in a chair, and there'd be like 5 chairs, and somebody popped the sugar cubes in your mouth, and the next group would get up. I remember standing in line for the smallpox vaccine, and they'd have the gun and they'd shoot you with the needles. And but it was all done through the school system because it was a matter of public health. It wasn't done through your pediatrician. And now that it's done through your pediatrician, people are seeing it differently instead of it being done through the government.
Of course, it is still a matter of public health, and my vaccinations came from school and the Army, at different times in my life. The only thing I ever got from the doctor's office, or actually generally it was the nurse's office at camp when I went out and cut myself or something, was a tetanus shot.
Yeah, and we've been 20 minutes into the show, and I'm trying not to get too engrossed in the conversation as I usually do on these shows and forget about Amy here. Amy, you let me know in the background that you had some things in the chat going on that you wanted to bring to our attention.
Yes, please. I do. I have some great comments and a question, too. Dorian B. says he has 5 biological children. All had their vaccinations. 4 are fine, and 1 is autistic. That is just life, and I would not have a little Brian any other way. Mike Bertelson says, when I was in boot camp in the Army, didn't care what childhood diseases I had. They just gave us all the shots. And he asks also, how do complication risks associated with, say, routine surgery compare to those of vaccines? And John Rapp says, my sister and I received our arm scars in 1970 prior to emigrating to Australia from the U.S.
All really good stuff. And since somebody brought up the autism thing, we all know where the whole vaccines cause autism thing started, but I'll let Bob go ahead and fill anybody in the live chat that is unaware of that as to, the brief history of that. But I find it interesting that he was talking about the MMR vaccine, but then the anti-vaxxers now today want to apply it to all vaccines in general. Bob?
Indeed. Yeah, they had this Dr. Andrew Wakefield who made it his crusade. Basically, my understanding of it is he was working with a group of attorneys that were suing people for quote-unquote vaccine injuries. And he came up with a very questionable study that had, I believe, 12 co-authors on it. And by the time they actually released the study to Lancet and it was accepted for publication, all but he had dropped out of that and did not appear in the original study. It was subsequently found that his methods were extremely questionable. The article had to be retracted by Lancet, and he ended up actually having his medical license revoked. It was probably one of the most dangerous and devastating acts of a physician that I know of. And I trace all of the measles outbreaks, the pertussis outbreaks we're having here in Michigan, the hepatitis outbreaks that we're having. I trace it all the way back to this guy trying to make a buck. And, it's just disgusting. And by the way, Amy, John Rapp asked a fascinating question in the chat, and you may want to keep that in your back pocket when it's appropriate to bring it out.
Absolutely.
And Jeff, I haven't heard your voice for a minute. Why don't you jump in and weigh in into the conversation thus far, and then we'll turn to Amy as a parent of an autistic child and let her weigh in on her opinion of this issue.
Yeah, sounds good. one of the things that I would like to mention that really bugs me about this whole anti-vax thing, all these people coming online and talking about don't get vaccinated, they're dangerous and all that stuff, and all they're really doing is spouting off a list of ingredients in the vaccinations that are being used today, and I don't think any of them really understand what they're reading. They're just getting the scare tactics of, well, this one can be dangerous or fatal. Yeah, in monstrous doses, but I don't think they really understand.
Would you willingly consume a poisonous element that explodes on contact with water if you had a choice?
No.
Okay.
No, I wouldn't.
Yet without it, you're going to die because sodium explodes on contact with water, and it is a key component of table salt, which is an essential, very important element for health. This is the problem that you run into. I had an anti-vaxxer come on out and post a meme on my Facebook page the other day that, vaccines contain embalming fluid. Cut me some freaking slack. First of all, there's a difference between sodium and sodium chloride. There's also a homeopathic amount of a preservative in vaccinations. You're dealing with a vaccine that may only have 2 cc's in it, and you would be very hard pressed to be able to even separate out and measure the amount of formaldehyde in it. And if you get right down to it, if you want to play that little game, some of the same atoms that are in milk are also found in gasoline, and who on earth would possibly want to ingest gasoline? And come on, guys, let's use a little common sense with this.
Yeah, I drank more formaldehyde in my beer when I was in Korea and Thailand in my Navy days than there is in all the vaccines I've ever had over the course of my lifetime.
I absolutely agree. There's 80 different chemicals in a cup of coffee and 4 known carcinogens. Come on, guys. I need to go get more coffee. I'm going to let Amy present. I'll be right back.
Yeah, Amy, it's your turn to weigh in.
Sure. There not only is it the anti-vax movement is affecting public health, it also perpetuates stereotypes as far as autism and the autistic community goes. They treat autism as if it's like an end stage disease where your child is going to die if they have it. No, for one thing. Two, it just puts a negative light on autism, and it just perpetuates the stereotypes of these people should be shunned and everything, and it makes life so much harder for us parents with autistic children. And some of these anti-vaxxers, the more militant ones, are actually quite nasty, and I've had some issues because I don't have any problems with people knowing that my son has autism. He has it, yep, and this is what our life is like, as to try to advocate for him and for others who also have it. I've gotten some really nasty things and said to me, and had many threats because I've vaccinated him, and I have no qualms about vaccinating him. And as a matter of fact, my arm is still sore from having my flu shot.
Whoa, wait a second here, Amy. You just said something amazing that I've never heard before. You said you received threats because you vaccinated your child.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Because I've had death threats saying I should die and my son should too because I vaccinated him. And I keep vaccinating him even though he has autism, which makes no difference.
Was this locally in like the real life? Was this in cyberspace, through email or YouTube? Where did you receive this sort of behavior?
Facebook, Twitter. I did get one from one person in real life, but that was so long ago, it doesn't matter, but they're gone now. Apparently they threatened one too many people. But yeah, I've gotten threats from people.
Well, to be honest with you, there was somebody that doxed BM Furball and I. And the reason that I was doxxed, including my home address, my full name, my office information, my office website, my political campaign website, and the reason that he went after me was my stance on vaccinations.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I've heard of the doxing thing because of this before, but I have never heard of anybody receiving death threats before. I'm flabbergasted.
Yeah, that's shocking.
He threatened to put a complaint in on my medical license. I told him, go for it, man.
Yeah, that's just ridiculous. Yeah, I was trying to call the AMA because a doctor is pro-vaccine. Yeah, that's not going to hold water. Linda, how about you? Anything to say so far? Thoughts?
Well, they were talking about shingles in the side chat, and that is another thing. We now have a chickenpox vaccine, and the shingles is a result of having the chickenpox as a child. So if you don't get the chickenpox vaccine for your child and your child gets the chickenpox, then you can get shingles as an adult. And shingles as an adult is not nice. It's very painful. It can be very painful. The pain can be lasting. It usually goes along a nerve root. I see a lot of shingle patients, and the rashes they get and the pain they have is very debilitating. It can be, and it's really something you don't want to have. They do have a vaccine for shingles now, which is helpful, but people still get shingles even with the vaccine.
That was a point that John Rapp made, and I think that's a really valid one too. Vaccines are not designed to prevent everybody from getting the disease. They're designed to, for example, cut your chances of contracting measles when you're exposed to it. Normally, if you're exposed to measles and you're not vaccinated against measles, you have about a 95% chance of contracting measles. If we can knock that down to 10, that's huge. And the other thing that you run into is the fact that the people around you are also vaccinated, and as a result, you have nobody that will infect you. You know, not last summer, but the summer before, I was a safety director of a training camp for teenagers. And one of the problems that we ran into is the Monday after everybody went home on Sunday, I got a call from my boss saying, "Hey, one of the kids was just diagnosed with pertussis. What do we do?" And well, crapping a brick wasn't a good option. I actually had to come up with an answer for it, but we had to notify the parents of every child that was at that camp.
And pertussis, if I'm not mistaken, is the medical term for what's more commonly called whooping cough?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
That's correct. By the way, have you ever seen anybody with whooping cough?
No.
Do you know why they call it whooping cough?
I assume it's because of the sound you make when you cough.
No. Actually, what happens is it has a machine gun or a staccato cough. You cough, 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 cough. That's what.
Oh, so you're coughing so hard that you can't breathe and you take huge gasps.
You know, watch a child with whooping cough once. There's videos of them on YouTube. That's what you're asking your child to take a risk of. And it goes on day in and day out, all day, all night. So basically plan on taking a week or so. You and your spouse are going to be sitting with that child, comforting them 24 hours a day. And that's assuming, of course, they don't get complications or they're not sick enough to go into the hospital, or God forbid they don't die.
Oh, wow. And Everybody, in the anti-vax movement, I think part of the rise for the anti-vax movement not only is the misinformation from Wakefield and misunderstanding what he was trying to do, which was basically market a single vaccine rather than a triple vaccine for his own personal financial gain. But I think part of the problem is that we haven't had outbreaks of things like smallpox and polio and measles, mumps, and rubella since these vaccines were introduced. So the general public isn't used to seeing the damage that it does and the death that it causes when these things are uncontrolled. So I think a bit of a discussion of what some of these diseases cause and what the long-term effects are if you survive and what the survival rates are is merited within this conversation.
Well, I'll take the lead on that one. 20 million people died as a result of Spanish influenza in 1919. All right, 1918, 1919, we had all these people in military camps demobilizing from World War I, and it ran rampant throughout the world, and we lost more people due to influenza than we lost to the war. Now, my mother almost died of Hong Kong flu in 1968. My friend Larry died of H1N1 influenza in 2010. And one of the things that really struck me is we had a potential swine flu epidemic in 1975, and President Ford initiated a huge vaccination campaign. And the problem is you got a handful of people that developed Guillain-Barré syndrome as a possible result of the vaccinations. But we're talking about a dozen versus something that could have killed millions. And one of the deadly things about flu, at least the Spanish influenza, which was a variation of H1N1 influenza, is that it killed by triggering the immune system. So the people that were most susceptible to it were actually the young and healthy with very robust immune systems. Now, right now, our major risk from just garden variety influenza is the very old and the very young. The people that are weakened to begin with. But yes, there's a huge number of complications. Measles is pneumonia and encephalitis. Mumps is sterility and deafness. And, these are not harmless diseases. Like I said, with measles, we had 48,000 hospitalizations a year prior to the introduction of the vaccine in the early 60s. These are not harmless diseases.
Yeah, I saw a conspiracy theorist video 6-ish months ago. I think the lady was claiming to be a homeopathic physician, and she was actually advocating for exposing your children to the measles. As if it was just this benign little rash, and they can just easily get over it. Kind of like back in the 60s and 70s when the parents thought it was advantageous to expose their children to other children who had chickenpox.
Well, I expose my children to rabid bats on a frequent basis because, that way they'll get it out of the way when they're young and we can kind of plan for it. So we have rabid bat parties. Get all the neighborhoods together.
Yeah, I know you're being sarcastic, but I thought I would point out that you're being sarcastic in case somebody watches this in replay and say, "Oh my God!"
Actually, my daughter was bit by a rabid bat, and my entire family had to go through the rabies stuff except for me. I was in the UP. But the cool thing about it is, even though my wife chased the bat down with a tennis racket, when they put the story in the newspaper that, oh my God, a local child was bit by a rabid bat, they said the father killed the bat. So I kind of walked around like Billy Badass for a while. My wife still gives me dirty looks at it because she's the one that went out and killed the bat, but I got the credit for it.
Wow, that is a scary thing to have happen. Is it true that the shots for rabies is really horrific? Like I always heard, like all these huge shots in your abdominal muscles. No,
they give them. They said they used to give them in the stomach and stuff. Now what you do is you get a series of about 12 shots. 6 of them are around the bite, and the rest of them are in your butt. It's just basically an immunoglobulin shot. But here's the problem that you run into. That bat was rabid. And when my daughter came and told my wife about it, woke her up and told my wife about it, it was the middle of the night. She wasn't quite fully awake. And, she basically told my daughter that she was dreaming. And, my daughter was just insistent. And she went and looked, and there was a freaking bat in her bed, crawled right into her bed and bit her. And if we had blown that off, if we had not gone in that night and gotten the first shots in the emergency room and she had contracted rabies, she would have died. People do not survive rabies for the most part. It is just not something that you get. People do not survive tetanus. And by the time you have symptoms of these diseases, it's too late to save you.
So had you waited until morning, then it probably would have been hopeless for her?
Yeah, there was a very good chance I would have lost my daughter. Yes.
Oh, God. Thank God you're not one of these anti-vaxxers, so yay for you. Jeff, you were going to say something here before I rudely jumped in front of you?
No, I just wanted to quickly mention, actually, I think the big thing about vaccines is not so much that they are the end-all be-all in protection, but it goes more towards the safety of the herd mentality. Is that correct, Bob? Am I wrong in saying that?
Yes, it is. It's kind of like seatbelts. You can point out the fact that, 1 in 200 people wearing a seatbelt gets worse injuries because they're wearing the seatbelt. Well, that's great, because 199 out of 200 get fewer injuries. I'll take those odds, Chief.
Absolutely.
And, the problem that you run into is that, yes, vaccinations are help you personally. But you have an obligation to society to protect the young children that are too young to have the vaccination and can contract these diseases that will kill them. You have an obligation to society to help people that don't have good immune systems, cancer patients, HIV patients. These people here are folks that you can literally kill just being around them if you have measles. And quite frankly, to suggest that you don't care about anybody else because you want your rights. Okay, well, no, it is a public health issue. If you wish to have the benefits of society, you have an obligation to society. It's just like washing your hands after going to the toilet if you are a food handler in a restaurant. That's not your freaking rights that I'm talking about. It is a public health issue, and you have an obligation not to spread disease to the people you are serving.
Yep. And on that note, Amy has poked me in the background to let me know that she has had some awesome comments in the live chat, which doesn't surprise me because our audience tends to be very awesome people. Amy?
Yes, they are. Thank you. Dorian B. remembers his mother having shingles. I've been told that he's been told that he has a greater risk of getting it as he has not had chicken pox. Not sure how true that is. And the question that, Dr. Bob, that you wanted me to hold on to, John Rapp says, this might be a stupid question, which it's not. Does vaccination actually make you fully immune to a disease, or do some still contract the disease? Globalist said Wacky Wakefield tried to peddle his own meds treatment, and a study on Q1 kids is not a study, but at most a probe for a study. And then Mike Bertelson says, we use EDTA to acid clean exchangers. Oh, it has been a preservative in mayonnaise for 50 years. Just saying. And Kristen Frost Laserbeam says, people are so terrible. What if we doxed all of these idiots for putting others at risk? We don't and would not, but that's their reasoning. Glad you're decent people. And then she asks also, I need to ask about the shingles vaccine. How old do I need to be to get it? And Ned McRant says, the Anti-Vaxer movement is a really criminally dangerous conspiracy in the world. It can kill millions when not stopped. John Rapp says, and I love this comment, we need a vaccination against the continuing spread in social media of disease, of gossip, especially vaxes cause autism. And then Kristen Frost Laserbeam says, what do you guys think drives and makes anti-vaxxers think the way they do?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great question. Let me address two of them real quick. One is John, and I already touched on this, but I want to reinforce it. Vaccines don't prevent you from getting diseases. They're not designed to prevent you from getting a disease. They're designed to reduce your chance of getting a disease. And in combination with herd immunity, that's a big freaking thing. And the second one is, I'm going to win my Nobel Prize in medicine by developing a vaccination for chemtrails.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God. What about you, Linda? I haven't heard your voice for a moment.
I'm still here. I just think this anti-vax movement is the dumbest people. I don't understand any of it. I just.
Well, Linda, what they're doing is they're preaching anti-vax to validate their own beliefs and make themselves feel better. They want to convince themselves they've made the right choice for their family by getting other families to make stupid choices with them.
Yeah, and we've been leaning pretty heavily on Bob with his medical expertise and the ins and outs of vaccines and complications and that. But Linda, you have dealt directly with clients in your physical therapy who've been injured because of communicable diseases. Can you give us more of a firsthand look of what that looks like throughout the course of that person's life? I think you told me in the background that one of your patients was a polio victim, and he's now in his 70s. How did that look like through the course of his life, and how did he deal with it versus how does he deal with it now as an elderly gentleman?
Well, he very much remembers being a child and contracting polio and receiving therapy as a child. And the result, when you contract polio as a child, you become paralyzed completely, and then you get some return. And it's one of the things that started my profession of physical therapy becoming a bigger profession because physical therapists were needed to perform exercises and movement to help with the return of the muscles and strength of people who were victims of polio. And so he remembers getting the training and his mom having to do it and being placed in a special ward and being placed in the special hospital. And then once all that was done, what he was left with was one leg that didn't work at all, one leg that did, and the rest, pretty much the rest of his body worked fairly well. And he went his whole life that way. Walking mostly with a cane, dragging his one leg along, and fiercely independent. Worked a job, which is a whole nother thing I get all the time with people on disability. But he lived his whole life fully. And then when he got older, in his late 70s, I don't remember completely what took him to the hospital. Frequently, they wind up with things like pneumonia, things that people get at that age. And he came to our facility for rehabilitation, but because he had one leg that was weak to begin with, when the rest of his body became slightly weaker from being in the hospital for, you put someone in bed for a few days of not moving, which is what hospitals do. They're treating the disease. They tend to make you stay in the bed. After a few days of laying in bed, you become extremely weak. And so you wind up needing therapy afterwards to regain your strength. So when he came to us, he was very weak. And at first, he could barely move. He had his own way of walking. He was very independent. And he was able to regain his ability to walk, but they had to modify his home. He could no longer do his stairs. They had to put in a ramp. He needed to have a caregiver that he never had before. And these were all things that were related to the fact that he had had polio as a child. Had he not had polio as a child, he would have recovered more quickly. He would have recovered back to his previous state before going into the hospital. He wouldn't have needed the accommodations at home. He would have been able to go home and have gone back to living his life instead of needing a caregiver, instead of needing a new ramp at home, instead of needing to use well, he was able to go back to a cane, but he could only walk a few feet. He couldn't walk as much as he was able to before. And he's not the only, he's the most recent person I've seen. I've seen that happen many times before. I've also had many patients with shingles, and I've seen the devastation of shingles also, and with the pain that people get from shingles and the debility from the pain and hitting, depending on where it hits.
I do pain management, and a good number of my patients have post-herpetic neuralgia. Mm-hmm. Which is, as you know, is horrible. You have shingles, that's bad enough, but the problem is once the shingles heals, those nerves are still damaged and you have pain in that area.
Yep.
And some of them require opiates for it. And, they come to me on opiates, and it's, then you run into that whole issue with addiction. The polio patients that already have trouble moving their limbs, you put them in bed because they're down with an illness. Now you have to worry about blood clots and,
Yeah.
People don't think through these things because they don't have the training to think through them, and that's fine. That's why you have to, seek the counsel of people that are experts in the field. Don't listen to somebody that, don't base your medical care on a YouTube video. Don't confuse a medical degree with your damn Google search.
Yeah, no kidding. The aging process is rough enough as it is, but to throw things like, injury because of polio or whatnot into the mix makes it even more so. I mean, I'm starting to feel the effects of aging. I'm in my late 50s now, and I have an autoimmune disease, commonly known as Crohn's. And I have noted that as I age, it's much more difficult for me to just suck it up and go to work. And it takes me longer to heal from one of my surgeries than it did when I was 20 or 30.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it does.
Yeah, it's a shame though we didn't have a vaccine for Crohn's or RA or anything like that, because I sure as hell would have took it. But anyway, Taddy was kind of poking me in the background a little bit, wanting to show a map of polio and measles throughout time during the vaccine periods, and I was going to ask him to put that up on the screen while Bob and Linda kind of discusses what we're looking at with that map and the graph. Teddy, you up for that?
Yep. It's showing now. The first one is measles. It's immunisation coverage with first dose of measles-containing vaccines. And that's from 1980 right up until 2016. Obviously, the red areas are the high coverage dosage, and the blue areas is sort of average. The light blue, not so much, not needed, and what have you.
Yeah, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is showing the areas that are being dosed with the vaccines. Does this graph, yes or no, speak to outbreaks of measles as well, or is it just coverage? I'm not sure.
That looks like a graph of the percentage of population that is covered by measles vaccinations. All right, you're seeing a higher percentage in the blue areas as time goes on. We're still running into a problem in the third world, say Central Africa, and they have high rates of measles and high rates of complications of measles. So you get countries like the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom and most of the European Union. These have relatively high rates of vaccinations, and when you see outbreaks in these areas, it is generally in groups that deliberately avoid taking advantage of those vaccinations. And as a result, they become like the third world.
Yeah, and Teddy, do we have anything that shows outbreaks within the same years that we're seeing here? Just to kind of compare and contrast a little bit.
I don't have anything on outbreaks, but I do have one for the second dosage, like the boosters. What's that one saying? Countries with measles containing vaccine second dose in national immunisation programme. As you'll see at the bottom right of the screen, it's from the World Health Organization. So this is just a page for their actual vaccination programme. It's just showing the spread of folks that have actually taken up the uptake of the booster or the second dose.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure Bob and Linda can both back me up on this statement that all those areas that are showing the increase in the vaccines also have a decrease in those communicable diseases, also have a increase in the population, not a decrease when the morons the conspiracy theorists start talking about they're using it for population control, whereas in the red pink areas like in Africa and whatnot that isn't getting that vaccine, they do have lower life expectancies. They do have greater amounts of outbreaks of these diseases. So I just thought this was interesting to show this color graph over time.
It is interesting.
It just goes to prove how effective immunization can be, or actually is.
Yes.
Yeah, and Bob, where did that concept that the conspiracy theorists try to talk about that they're trying to use vaccines for population control, and when they say that they mean lower the population, is that just fear and delusional thinking, or where did that particular aspect crop up within the anti-vax movement? Do you know?
Well, the hallmark of a conspiracy theory, or as I like to call them, conspiracy stories, because they're not really worthy most of the time of the title theory, is you have to have a nefarious them that is trying to do something terrible to you. And, they are the ones creating this conspiracy, and you're the awake one that sees them for what they're doing. So you have to have somebody that you can blame. And then that brings your little group together on YouTube. And then what you do is you sit down and you promote this to your family and friends to try and validate your own beliefs. And that's one of the reasons that you see flat smacking in the flat earth, where people are jumping out of vans and assaulting school kids by making them, questioning an 8th grader on whether or not they believe, they have evidence that the earth is a sphere. That just makes them feel better because then their beliefs are somehow validated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in this case, validating the beliefs and causing the spread of those beliefs is actually doing harm to the public good and safety. I strongly object to that.
And their own children and their children's friends. All right. It's a terrible thing to do to a community. And the problem is you have these activists that go into, like the Somali community in Minnesota, fell victim to these anti-vaxxers, and then they had an enormous measles outbreak. We had we get them in charter schools with high rates of immunization waivers. We had a pertussis outbreak in Traverse City last year. Pertussis, for Christ's sake.
Yeah, and I like to be balanced when I talk about these things. I don't like to just point the finger at the conspiracy theorist. I like to look at myself and my own community as well, and I know that there are those in our community that accept science, that is pro-vaccine, who tend to go a little overboard with, the anti-vaxxers and say, that they're traitors to society and they should be shot. I think that's going a bit far. I understand their enthusiasm and where that frustration is coming from, but to make that kind of a strong statement to me is that's going too far. And I will even go so far as to use the term reprehensible behavior on our part when we take it that far.
No, we don't
Yeah.
take it that far, and we don't deny parents medical care for their children because the parents are making bad decisions. We don't penalize them for it. You know?
No, and it should be about education
Yeah.
and soothing their fears, not punishment because they don't
Exactly.
follow the status quo.
But my question would be, where do we actually draw the line between your personal rights and freedoms and mandated public safety?
Well, exactly. And by the way, I just put a link in the side chat there. Go ahead and stick that up for a sec.
Oh, give me
Go
2
for it.
seconds.
Yeah, but the difference between public health and individual rights is a sticky one. Should you fire a nurse because she doesn't want to get an influenza shot? This impacts individual rights, but you have to weigh public safety against individual rights sometimes. That's why we have speed limits. That's why, that's what public health is about. We put the lock on the pump handle and cholera goes down. People have to walk further for water, but the cholera was coming from that damn pump.
Yeah, my basic rule of thumb for me personally, in answer to this question, is that I can make whatever choices I make as a rational adult that affect me, my wife, and my children. But when those decisions start to affect people outside of my own home, then I have to consider the public good, society's welfare, as equal to or greater than my own.
The thing is, if you want the benefit of free public education, there are rules that come with that. If you don't want to follow the rules and you want to get a vaccine waiver, fine, homeschool them. That's your right.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't have a right to endanger another family's child.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There are a lot of states now that are changing laws, like New York City. Now, because of the measles outbreak there, changed the rules that you have to have vaccinations to go to the public schools there.
That graphic will speak to that specifically that I'm having them put up.
And in my state of Connecticut, they're trying to pass laws to disallow religious waivers, and the anti-vaxxers, when they have these hearings, the anti-vaxxers are out in bulk claiming they have religious waivers for religious reasons is why they all have waivers. However, when the immunity rates at the public schools are below, I think in some of our public schools are below 95%, then you're losing the herd immunity. And so the state is trying to change those laws to eliminate religious exemptions and make them only medical exemptions is the only reason you can go to school without vaccines. Right now, Connecticut allows for religious, and that's where the anti-vaxxers have a loophole because they claim a religious exemption and they don't have to explain their religious exemption.
Well, if you look at this graphic that I put up, this is measles in the Orthodox Jewish community, which is being targeted by the anti-vaxxers, and especially New York City.
Yeah.
And as you can see, look, 410 cases in New York. We got, and it's coming over here to Michigan, here in Detroit, it's 40. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting concept. If you want to have a right of return to Israel, and there's suspicion you're doing it for nefarious reasons to escape punishment in your home country or something or other like that for breaking, for criminal activity or anything, they will actually question, okay, well, how Jewish are you? When's the last time you went to temple? Let's discuss some theology. All right. Show me the theology behind your religious exemption to vaccinations, and then show me that you're employing that theology in other aspects of your life other than to get a waiver. Okay? show me where in your holy book that says you shouldn't get vaccinated to measles. Okay. I'm personally a big supporter of just waivers for vaccinations on people that have demonstrable medical contraindications to them.
Exactly.
And, I look at religious exceptions to vaccinations or personal choice exceptions to vaccinations with a grain of salt, shall we say, or should I say, an exploding metal and a chemical warfare agent in combination,
Mhm.
which is what salt is, of course.
Yeah,
I don't
and
agree with that. The religious waivers.
yeah, and aluminum can do the same thing. Uncoated aluminum, when it is exposed to water, will explode. That's why we get foundries, but that explode. But the type of aluminum that's being used in some vaccines is there to stimulate an immune response. It's not, and it's very, very small amount. It's not of the exploding type, much like the sodium that you're talking about.
And a lot of the aluminum, and on the rare occasions that mercury is it's generally in salts, which is an inert form of it. But it's designed specifically it's an adjunctive substance in the vaccination to promote a more vigorous immune response.
And Amy just poked me in the background a minute or so ago to let me know we have more awesome comments from our awesome viewers. Amy, what did they got to say to us?
Oh, they have some great comments to make. Joseph Grant says he was born many years before the measles vaccine, and when he was 8, he lost a wonderful childhood friend to the disease. Vaccinate. I'm so sorry to hear that, Joseph. Kristen Frost Laserbeam says conspiracy theory scientists get people who call themselves smart but have no expertise. Eleanor gets Bob and Linda type people. Any guesses which ones are better to listen to? John Rapp says, my good friend believed a social media spread among Sydney eastern suburbs private school soccer moms. She believed standard claims until I sent her numerous medical article debunks. And then Dorian says, use the internet for self-diagnosis is bad. I remember my mom having a medical book, and every time she was ill, she would read it, and it turned her into a hypochondriac. Kristen Frost answered him and says, yeah, reading on symptoms is okay as long as some good questions from it to ask your doctor when they diagnose you. And then Mike Bertelson had a great question. How is the anti-vax movement affecting areas that should be fully immunized? And then Kristen Frost Laserbeam says, goodness, people who have weak minds always have to blame someone for misfortune. They cannot fathom that sometimes bad stuff happens for no reason sometimes. And then H. Desert Rat says, I am living proof of the results of vaccines. Born in 1991, I was among the first children vaccinated. Vaccines work.
My driver's ed partner died at age 16 from meningitis. These are things that actually are still around. So that's all I'm going to say with that. And as far as not getting vaccinated and going into society, if you contract measles, and you can still contract measles, because if you come in contact with it, you will contract it. Okay, then you go into your school and basically you're Typhoid Mary. Now, even if only 10% of the people that you run across contract measles because their vaccinations knock them down, that means that 1 in 10 children that you come in contact with could get measles. And then those people can go on out and expose the rest of them, and 1 in 10 of those people are going to get measles. You see how it's just snowballs? This is how we get mini epidemics. And why we have such a vigorous public health response. They shut the school down immediately. They put everybody at home on quarantine until they demonstrate they're healthy.
Yeah, it can snowball really quickly. And one of the things I was wondering about, Linda or Bob, the one of you who wants to address it, is what is the percentage of people who have an allergic response to whatever vaccine? And then for those who are allergic to the vaccines, how does the medical profession address immunization protection for those individuals?
Would you like me to take that one, Linda?
Yes, please.
All right. If you have an allergic reaction to a vaccination, generally they're minor, they're skin reactions. My brother used to get a swollen arm from the old tetanus vaccines, but they're an inconvenience. That's really all there is. I mean, you get a little symptomatic care for it. You put a little ice pack on the arm. Okay, well, swollen arm's not going to kill you. If you look at vaccination rates in the millions, like we did with swine flu, you may run into a dozen or so that have some sort of a major complication from a vaccination, or that could be potentially tied to a vaccination, such as Guillain-Barré was the one they were worried about. So how do we deal with people that can't take vaccinations? The bottom line is herd immunity. And that is, we try and prevent them from coming in contact with the disease by preventing the disease in the society around them. And, obviously we keep a close eye on them. If they start whooping, well, we're going to be very suspicious of that.
Yeah.
So in general, yeah, the allergic response is pretty mild, and
Yeah.
we protect them because we're vaccinated. It all makes sense. But like you say, when you start getting more and more people who are not allergic to it, that aren't being immunized, then of course that reduces the herd mentality and puts the people with the allergic response more at risk.
No, not herd mentality, herd immunity.
Did I say mentality? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I got up
times.
at 4 a.m. my time for this show, and I've had a whole pot of coffee, but my brain is still a little foggy. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say it like that.
Yeah, it's herd immunity.
God.
What you do is you basically little bighorn them. You can't do anything for them, but you deal with everybody around them and prevent them from coming in contact with it. That's really the only strategy that you can have. And vigilance, that increases the medical resources they use as well, because you've got to be more vigilant with them.
Yeah, not being a licensed physician, I do have a question I'm a little curious about. Most of these contagions that we're talking about seem to be contact contagious, but is there any time in the stage of those diseases that they become airborne?
Well, you get diseases like tuberculosis and things like that. And measles is quite contagious too. It's, they're droplet infections is what they do. Is when you sneeze or cough, you spew out all of these droplets full of virus, and then people breathe them in and come in contact with it on their hands, and then put their fingers in their mouths, and this is the way these things are spread lots of times. Now, as far as getting something that's airborne that you get through a ventilation system, we had an issue with a public health department where I worked once, where they had a defective duct in the ventilation system, and the TB treatment area was ventilating the rest of the building. And a lot of the people that actually worked at the public health department seroconverted their PPDs, indicating that they had been exposed to TB and successfully fought it off.
So there's a lot more than just touching the wrong thing.
And were they pissed?
Yeah, there's a new hospital which has been opened up in Glasgow. It's actually going through similar teething issues now with a viral outbreak. It looks as though it's possibly the ventilation system has been the fault there as well. That's just the
You're from
research is
Glasgow?
happening.
I didn't realize you were Scottish.
I know, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, and one of our viewers in the last round of Amy's shouting out the the comments that said, who would you rather listen to, people like Bob and Linda, or the anti-vaxxers or other conspiracy theorists. Well, I'd rather listen to Bob and Linda anytime, even over and above listening to myself. As I just showed a moment ago, I can be an idiot, and have a slip of the tongue. Oh my God, I still feel like a moron. But anyway, I was wondering. I know things like viruses like influenza will mutate over time. So a vaccine that we had 3 years ago isn't going to work today. So we have to keep pace with that. What about things like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox? Do those things evolve the same way, or are they? I don't know how that works.
Not the same way. The way the influenza vaccine works is they go on over to China, because that seems to be where a lot of these things originate. They go on over to China and they try and figure out what's going to hit the United States in 3 years. I mean, I'm talking, as an American right now. I mean, other countries do similar things. I'm not U.S. centric here, but they'll go on over there and figure out, what do we think is going to hit the United States in 3 years? Because it takes time to develop a vaccine and then incubate millions of doses of that vaccine, and they use a variety of ways to do that. They use eggs, they use human fibroblasts from tissue cultures, and so on and so forth. But there's a ramp-up time to do that, and then they immunize everybody. So sometimes they guess well, sometimes they guess poorly. Sometimes you get influenza vaccination that could be extraordinarily effective, like above 50%, and sometimes you get a year that, you might as well be peeing in a thunderstorm. You reduce the number of flu cases by about 12%. We do the best we can. But as far as things like smallpox and polio and varicella, which is chickenpox / shingles, and meningitis, these are things that we can get really good vaccinations against.
Yeah, and you determine the human fibroblasts, the human tissue cultures. That just reminded me, I heard a conspiracy theorist, an anti-vaxxer, not very long ago, making the statement that there is a aborted fetus stem cell tissue within vaccines.
And it's a male, and that's exactly what it is. It's absolutely true. And it's a male, and that's where it came from. And it could have just been disposed of as medical waste, but instead the fibroblasts from that aborted fetus go on to save millions of lives. And it's the fibroblasts. It's a particular cell line from that fetus. We're not going to get into that with this right now, but my feelings on it is I think every one of them is a tragedy. And sometimes you have to sit down and try and make the best you can when you're dealing with a tragedy. And this is an opportunity that we took, and it has saved that cell line has saved millions of lives.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, but like you, I don't want to get into a debate about that thing. That's not anything I want to get into.
I don't talk politics, and I don't talk politics. I don't try not to talk religion too much, and I certainly don't talk that.
Yeah, I don't either. I just wasn't sure if that was an accurate statement coming from an anti-vaxxer. But anyway, moving on.
Yeah, once again,
Jeff, Linda,
there is a grain of truth in it. It's a fibroblast cell line, but they make it off, as if there's a fucking foot in it or something. Come on, guys.
Yeah. So anything, Jeff or Linda, do you got anything to add thus far before we turn over to Amy and see what else is going on in the live chat?
The whole anti-vax thing, they're a lot like most other conspiracy theorists. They latch onto one thing and blow it all out of proportion to scare people. And a lot of what we do in this community is we know we're not going to change their minds, but we do hope to educate those that are sitting on the fence or not sure what to believe, and point them in the right direction. And on that note, I would like to ask both Linda Amanda and Bob, are there things that you would recommend people to do if they're thinking of maybe not vaccinating? Resources they can look into or things like that?
Sure.
Linda, we can both answer this, but please, ladies first. I've spoken too much here.
That's okay. Well, what they can do is look into vaccines. First thing to do is go to the CDC websites. And I think you had mentioned you linked some websites or had some links
They're in the side chat.
in the side chat that talk about vaccines and vaccine safety. Vaccines go through the FDA just like any other medication or drugs. They are monitored. They're just as safe as anything else. Talk to your physician. They're the expert. Talk to your pediatrician. Those are probably the best things. I mean, people don't talk to the experts. They don't talk to the person who went to school forever to train for this, the physician. And
Exactly.
Well, probably my suggestion on it would be is stay in your wheelhouse to some extent and use the resources that you have available to you. If you have time to watch a YouTube video on vaccinations, you have time to make an appointment with the local public health department and speak to one of their nurses about the risks of vaccinations and what their recommendation would be, and tailor that to your individual child's needs.
Yeah.
I can't. I have when I was in med school, of course, we started learning about things, and I was convinced that I had dengue fever once. But, I'm a relatively intelligent person. We all fall into these traps. But that's why lawyers don't represent themselves in court, because you're too close to the situation. You need to take a step back, and you need to consult an expert in this and spend a few minutes with them. And this is one of the greatest problems that we have in medicine right now. And I've actually done a bit of a series on this on my channel because I think it's important. I did a video, for example, on that 15-minute talk that you should have had with your doctor when he diagnosed you with diabetes, where I just sit down and explain the disease to you and how we treat it and how you can help me monitor it and make my job a little bit easier. And we did the same thing with addiction and pain management. I probably ought to do one specifically for vaccinations, although I did about 4 videos on vaccinations, not from an anti-vax standpoint, but from just, advice for parents thinking about vaccinating their, with questions about vaccinating their children. Take advantage of the experts that are out there. And, contrary to popular belief, I don't even use vaccinations in my practice. And B, public health nurses don't get bonuses for giving vaccination shots. They just don't. Because, it's them doing it. Them putting the public health nurses up to it. That's part of a conspiracy theory. They don't get any benefit other than the fact their children are a little safer when they go to school.
Yeah, exactly. Logical?
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add on those particular points. You guys pretty much covered that. So at this time, I'll turn over to Amy and see if she has anything from the live chat. And if she does, great. And if not, we'll let her weigh on the conversation herself.
Sure. I've got some good ones too. The Mandalorian says when he joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1989, on the first 2 days of boot camp, they vaccinated us for damn near everything. We got about 15 different shots in arms and buttocks. Painful days they were. Globus Schillis says influenza does not mutate too much. There are lots of variants. Every year it's another variant that is getting more active. Sometimes they gamble the wrong variant. Kristen Frost Laserbeam James says, we eat, inhale, etc. human DNA all the time, not knowing. Skin cells are in the air. When you kiss, etc. People need to relax. John Rapp says, so about the stream, it's not rocket science, but it's complicated. That's why conspiracists get their wedges of doubt into the issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, when I joined the Army, they gave me, we just walked down a line and they nailed you in both arms and then they handed me a machine gun. I was a happy kid.
Yeah, and I went to Navy boot camp back in the mid 80s, and they didn't care what my childhood immunization record said. They were just going to take care of the whole gambit, like it or not. I was just part of the enlistment process.
Same for me in the Canadian Armed Forces. Just marched us through a big tank hangar, and it was just needles and pokes from one end to the other, with a grand slam in the butt at the end.
Well, it's, the bottom line in the Army Medical Department, or any of the services from any country, is preserve the fighting strength. Look at the rates of disease in the Civil War and in World War I. And then we started immunizing people. Well, didn't we do it in World War II? I'd actually have to check that.
I think they did.
I don't think we had a lot of immunizations.
No, we didn't.
Smallpox and the BCG for tuberculosis. I don't know if we had yellow fever immunizations yet or not. But you immunize the troops so they're not sick. You have sick soldiers, you have fewer troops. And if you're in a healthy army against a unhealthy army, you have an advantage.
Yeah, that was a big issue in the Pacific Theater because most of them were in the Asian region. A lot of dengue fever and malaria. So yeah, that was debilitating for a lot of our servicemen.
Well, the problem is you get malaria, it's not something that you take 2 weeks off of the war and then go back to the front. I mean, you're trashed for months.
Mm-hmm. You are, and dengue.
And then you relapse.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've pretty much covered a lot of the education about vaccines. One thing we haven't covered a whole heck of a lot was the main conspiracy claim that these vaccine causes autism. I don't really like to impose too much on everyone's time on these shows, so I don't like to go over 2 hours. We got about a half hour left. We can start wrapping up in the next few minutes and have another show on December 15th, which is our normal schedule, where we discuss more about autism, what it is, what it isn't, and why vaccines have nothing to do with it. Or we can take a bit of time and discuss that now. What do you guys think?
I'm just going to make one quick statement. I want you to specifically tell me the documented cause of autism. Because if you can't answer that question, you can't say that the vaccinations cause it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in my profession, it's been a while since I've been working, but I don't remember ever reading about a specific documented cause at all.
It's right on that. It's right on that line that marijuana is a gateway drug.
Yeah,
it's something that people talk about, but it's not a gateway drug. It just isn't. Alcohol is a gateway drug, but you say things because you want to justify your position. And it falls under the same line. You want to justify your decision and validate it. And the only way that you can really do that is A, stick to the party line, the narrative, and B, bring others into the fold to agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do know that when it comes to things like autism, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding. Conspiracy theorists will talk about it being on the rise, while at the same time not understanding that the mental health profession and the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual that we use in its 5th edition has expanded the diagnosis criteria and is taking other diagnoses like Asperger's and put it into the autism spectrum.
Well, there's another
you know,
there's another issue that you have to think about with that too. I have 3 rules of medicine that I have used my entire career. Number 1 is common things happen commonly. Number 2 is if you don't look for it, you won't find it. And number 3 is if you let them, people will tell you what's wrong with them. Rule number 2 of the House of Bob is that if you don't look for it, you won't find it. Conversely, if you do look for it, you'll find more of it. We have become acutely aware of autism since about 1980, and we're starting to actually look for it. And parents are educated as far as the signs and symptoms of it, and so are teachers. And they're picking it up more because they're talking about it. In the 50s, they didn't. It's just as simple as that. We're looking for it.
Yeah. I myself, as a teacher, have had to learn new methodologies to deal with students in my classroom who may show symptoms of autism.
You ever picked one up that was an unknown that turned out to have autism?
I thought I had, but I was wrong. I'm not a doctor, but it did turn out that he had ADHD.
All right.
Okay.
Well, the issue with it is a high degree of suspicion. All right.
Mm-hmm.
When you test for HIV, we give you a very gross screening test that picks up people with HIV and picks up, half of them may have it, half of them may not, but they all come back positive. That's why we do a confirmatory test with a Western blot to find the ones that, of this group that is very likely to have it. You pick out the ones that actually do have it.
Mm-hmm.
You, sir, are a screening test for autism and ADHD.
Yeah,
And,
that's the way
and if you can identify a possible candidate, that means they get looked at a little closer. That's a good thing.
Yeah. Even though I was wrong about him being autistic, at least we found out he had ADHD, and he's doing better.
One of the things that I was taught in med school is when you're dealing with a surgeon and interviewing a surgeon to take care of your patients, because doctors, primary care docs that aren't surgeons generally pick a surgeon or two that they like to work with. What you do is you look for the surgeon that, on their appendectomies, for example. You don't want to find somebody that 100% of their appendectomies came back as appendicitis, because that means they're waiting a little too long. You don't want to have somebody that gets 50% yes and no, because they're operating on everybody. You want to get the one that has about 80% are positive. That means that they have a high degree of suspicion and they're willing to operate, but they're not overdoing it. And it's the same thing, you're gonna pick up a few kids that don't have autism or don't have ADHD, but I'd rather you pick up a couple of false positives, as long as you're getting the true positives.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and unfortunately, most of the general public that don't work in the either medical or mental health professions don't understand autism, and the only thing that they have to go by is Hollywood. Things like Rain Man and Sling Blade and that kind of stuff, and that really doesn't paint an appropriate picture for what the autism spectrum is.
Absolutely.
Amy, you deal with that every day of your life. You want to kind of clarify a little bit about what I just said? Amy, did I lose you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
we can-
Okay.
Oh,
Okay,
gotcha
good.
now. Yeah.
I just had a little blip there with my. Yes, living with autism every day. I have a rule of thumb about that. You meet one person with autism, you've met only one person with autism. It seems to manifest itself in so many some kids have some symptoms, kids have other symptoms, some
Yeah, they're all
hardly show at
different.
all. They're all so different, vastly different. And
Well, we learned the
when
triggers
my
with my son, and
Mhm.
we just learned to avoid those triggers. And now he's he's a computer programmer for a major insurance company. It's one that he doesn't have to deal with the
Awesome.
public too much, but it allowed him to really focus on his talents.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we're working on right now. And when he goes to high school, that's what they're going to be really working on too, is what talents he can do. And we're going to be thinking about, what he's going to be able to do as an adult too.
That's what the
I wanted to stay
IEPs are
tuned.
for.
Absolutely. And we do. We have meetings all the time. When he was diagnosed, we had so many assessments to do to figure out whether or not that's what it was, and it obviously turned out to be. But we had assessments. I had to do assessments at home. His school had to do tons of assessments, and I actually have to get them every year. I have to make sure that his diagnosis is up to date. So he just had his this last year, and that's when they formally diagnosed him this time with depression and anxiety, and that usually that's what the doctor said to me anyway, was that those two diagnoses go along with autism and ADHD. He was diagnosed with that as well. So it's an ongoing process. I mean, he has to be, and that's how. And they're very thorough when they ask you everything about his behaviors and what he does and everything. It's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, and Linda, Bob, and I, in the course of our education and training, have had classes and training in childhood development. And the anti-vaxxers want to point at autism as being caused by vaccines because, well, the vaccines start to be introduced in early childhood. The autism starts to show a little bit around the ages of 4 to 6 initially. But, according to what I've learned in college and in my profession about early childhood development, that's about the age when a child starts to become less in their own head and starts to recognize that there's something outside of themselves and start to interact with their environment more on an extroverted basis, and so as the child comes from the inside of their head to the outside environment, that's where we start to notice those things. But it doesn't have anything to do with the vaccines. It just has to do with how we learn. We don't really know what causes autism, but but it's noticeable because of the change in perspective from toddler to early childhood. And you understand what I'm saying? I'm probably not explaining that very well, Bob.
Well, let me add to that real quick, and that is that when does autism start to rear its head? Right around the time you're getting a lot of vaccines. All right. Now, whether you have vaccines or not, that's when autism is going to rear its head. It's a coincidence. I could sit down and show you a study where they tried to relate death due to automobile accident to serum cholesterol levels. You can find a correlation in damn near anything.
Oh, yeah.
Sign of the zodiac. I mean, that's called data mining. It doesn't necessarily mean, just because there's a correlation doesn't mean it's a causation. You have to show the mechanism by which it causes it, which is a big problem that I run into with this vaccination cause autism thing. We don't know what causes autism, so you can't demonstrate a mechanism by which a vaccine leads to that that cause. So, come on, guys.
Coincidence was the word I was looking for in my little rant there, and I was losing my word. And I'm like, oh my God, what's the word I'm looking for?
Exactly.
I think that as far as children presenting as autism, I think a lot of times parents are looking for a reason, and autism is one of those things. There is no reason that we don't know what causes it. And so a lot of parents are looking, if I have a reason, then it's not my fault. I didn't do anything. Even though they didn't do anything to begin with, they're still looking for a reason. And I think that may be why people latch onto this.
I think that is an extraordinarily profound observation, Linda, and I think you're dead on.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because I can tell you that I actually blame myself for the longest time for my son's autism. I did. I still do to some extent.
You
that.
It was the fear you had in the 10th grade, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Too many stealing of mom's green peppers out of the garden when I was younger. It was my punishment. It's just, you do. I mean, that's a natural reaction, something like that, when you have such a, because it is, when you first find out, it is a big, scary diagnosis, because there's not, there isn't much information as much now, and so it's
right.
It's but now but I wouldn't have any other way, honestly. I wouldn't, yeah, there's a lot of blame there. So but I did what I thought was best when I saw all the studies and everything. I went, hey, you know what? I'm going to ask my doctor about that, because we have an appointment coming up. We have lots, so we have plenty of time to ask. So I did, and I think that was my experience with the anti-vax movement for myself. That was weird. I'll ask my doctor, and that's pretty much that was pretty much my extent of movement until it really started to rear its ugly head.
Well, I think a lot of people, it's funny because the name of the show becomes Logic and Reason Wins Out. But there are people who don't have logic and reason, so they latch on to the conspiracy. In your case, logic and reason won out, and you realize that
it did.
it wasn't reasonable.
The other thing that you have to think about too is that there's a certain type of person that buys into this. And they did a study a while ago. There was a pediatric practice, I think it was in Pittsburgh, that just put out a routine little thing on their Facebook page about, hey, come on and get your kids vaccinated. And the anti-vaxxers just descended upon them. So what they did was they actually did a study. They traced back the Facebook pages of the anti-vaxxers and looked at their characteristics, their gender, their occupations. They looked at the other pages that they liked, and they found that, a lot of the anti-vaxxers are real big followers of other conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah.
They live within conspiracy theory and conspiracy theory. Shelley Lewis gave a talk down at the Flat Earth Convention in Dallas that I highlighted yesterday. And, in the course of them talking about her awakening in the flat Earth, she started talking about fake moon landings, the anti-vax program, chemtrails were mentioned. They didn't talk about Bigfoot, but Bigfoot has a much bigger chance of being real than the link between the MMR and autism.
Yeah. And when I was going through my degree program, I got curious about myself when we were studying things like autism. And I had my clinical supervisor evaluate myself, because I am a natural introvert. And over the course of my development into adult years, I had to work very, very hard in learning to operate socially within larger groups, and by that I mean more than 4 or 5 people. Even coming live on this show and on the Shills and on my own personal YouTube channel, it's difficult for me to release a video because I'm always second guessing myself because I feel like I sound stupid. And what we found was that I am mildly on the spectrum. So it can range anywhere from people like myself who have a certain level of introversion. And on the other side of the spectrum, years ago, I worked with a gentleman about my same age who was more severely autistic. He was unable to speak. He was severely agoraphobic, and I was working with him on a home health care basis. So there's a wide range in what the spectrum is and how we approach each individual, and it has to be tailored to each individual because, like Amy said, when you meet a person with autism, all you've met is a person with autism.
Yeah. Well, certain professions too tend to collect certain things. You look at doctors and lawyers. The people that make it through that selection process, even to get into school and then take on that responsibility, many of them are, in some cases, borderline bipolar. And the definition of bipolar is hyper-efficient asshole. And how many doctors and lawyers does that describe? The difference between that and a mental, and a mental impairment with it is whether or not they're impaired in function. But sometimes these things play to the strength. My son is a computer programmer. It suits him very, very well.
Yep, and I think that's why when before I went back to college, I was an over-the-road truck driver. One of the reasons I chose that job is because I didn't have to deal with people. And then when I did go to college, I chose a profession that I only had to deal with one or two people at a time. It's just much easier for me, And with that, I think I'll look over at Amy again and see if there's anything going on in the live chat that she might want to bring to our attention.
Yes, there are a couple things. John Rapp said, didn't this whole anti-vax with that false medical study claiming it causes autism? And then Dorian B says, I don't like being around lots of people. It makes me feel uncomfortable. My missus reckons I'm on the spectrum. I am a lot emotionless. And then Digital Demonic Davros says he has been diagnosed as an underachieving intellectual before. His son has recently been diagnosed with GDD, which is global developmental disorder.
Interesting.
Jeff, you sounded like you had something that you were chewing on there.
No, it's not being a medical profession and not really knowing very much about autism. I really don't want to comment too much, but hearing you guys talk about your personal experiences, like yourself, Logical, I get the feeling that I'm probably a little bit on the spectrum as well, because I have many of the same issues growing up as you just mentioned. So.
Well, one thing I'll say to that, though, is do not self-diagnose. And I'll say this to everybody in the audience at home. If you have a question, seek help from your medical or mental health professional. Do not self-diagnose.
That's exactly where I was going. I think maybe I should look into it and talk to somebody. Anyways, that's
Bob,
all I have.
Linda? Okay, Bob and Linda, do you have anything? Or should we start moving toward final thoughts and a wrap-up?
I thought that was very well said.
All right. Well, it sounds like we're kind of winding down naturally. I'm sorry, Linda, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to say that was pretty good. The thing that I wanted to mention was something Amy had said earlier about having more people diagnosed with autism being different things with her child with school. My daughter has ADHD, and I look at how, especially with autism, because I have a friend who's a speech therapist in a school system, and that's what she deals with mostly is autistic children. She also deals with everything in the school that needs speech therapy. But there is a big uptick in autism and the diagnosis, but I just think of the services my daughter had versus the services kids are getting today. They're just getting better today than they did years ago. And my daughter was in my daughter was in a generation where they were just starting to diagnose and treat kids like her with ADHD, or kids with autism, or kids with, other diseases. They did have the diagnosis, but they didn't have all the resources. There are a lot more resources available today than there were 20 years ago. So just my 2 cents on that. That's another reason you're seeing more kids diagnosed with autism.
Yeah, and like Bob said earlier, it's because we're looking for it, and we look for it because we want to help. We want to improve the quality of life for those individuals. So with that, I think we'll move over to Dr. Bob for some final thoughts on today's show.
Vaccinate your kids and have a look and see whether or not you might need a few, because there actually are vaccines for adults. Children that are in high school, there's a couple of things that you really ought to look at. You ought to look at immunizing, re-immunizing girls around age 16 to 18 for rubella, because the original vaccines can wear off, and when you're pregnant, if you get German measles, it's devastating to the infant. You get something called a Harlequin infant if you ever want to have freaking nightmares. So when girls in their late teens should probably be revaccinated for rubella. Meningitis for kids going to college, going away to school, into dorms. Cold weather doesn't cause colds. Cold weather drives everybody inside, and they all breathe each other's air. That's how colds get spread during the winter. Same thing with meningitis in college dorm rooms or military barracks. Think seriously if you're my age. I'm 57. If you're my age, think seriously about getting a pneumonia vaccine. Get tested for get tested for Hep C and Hep B. And you can get vaccinations for both hepatitis A and hepatitis B. These are things that adults need to think about too. And God knows, if you're going to be traveling someplace, consult somebody that's a travel medicine specialist, because you may need to get vaccinated against yellow fever, which we don't routinely vaccinate for here. But look into it. At least ask the questions and make an informed decision.
Absolutely. And Linda, final thoughts from you?
Big one, I agree with Bob, but big one, don't get your medical advice from YouTube.
Or your earth science.
Or your earth science.
Anything else there, Linda? Or?
No, I think this was very good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we really appreciate both of you joining us. And Jeff, what about you? Final thoughts?
Well, great show. I've actually learned quite a lot tonight, more than I thought I would. And as Dr. Bob says, get yourself vaccinated, especially if you're traveling. I came to Vietnam from Canada, and I got the full range of booster shots before I came out, and I'm glad I did, because not more than 2 years after I got here, a friend of mine here picked up dengue fever, and he was messed up for a while. So yeah, don't play games with your health. Do like Linda says, go see your doctor. Don't get your advice from YouTube. And yeah, that's it.
Do you know what the other name for dengue fever is?
I'm not sure.
It's called breakbone fever, because it feels like your bones are breaking.
Yeah. He was messed up for a long time.
That will screw you up. We used to see it out in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds nasty. Amy, I'm going to look over at you and ask you if you have any final thoughts, or if there's any final thoughts from the live chat, or both.
Yeah, a little bit of both, please, if that's okay. Creaky Blinder says, awesome, guys. Vaccines cause adults. And he's correct. And that's what I would say. Keep up to date on your vaccinations. Just stay healthy, help everybody else stay healthy. And, an autism diagnosis isn't the end of the world. Yes, it's sometimes can be devastating, but it's not caused by vaccines. You know, and if you have questions, please ask a medical professional and not YouTube.
You know, one thing that I'd really like to draw the analogy to is why are there laws against drinking and driving? Yes, it's to protect you. It's also to keep you from running running into my child who's trying to come home from work. Same thing with vaccinations, my friends.
Yes.
Yep, all about public safety. Tabby, you've been patiently taking care of all of our whistles and bells and keeping the stream operating smoothly. Do you have any final thoughts on today's show?
I can just echo what everyone said here. To be quite honest with you, I found this quite educational and enlightening. Get yourselves vaccinated. It's
Hey,
simple
could
as
I
that.
add one thing? Could I add one thing to this too?
Absolutely, go
Some
ahead.
comments out there, and and the comments that everybody else is making. I think I'm going to mirror this if it's okay with you on my channel, and I think maybe if Creaky Blinder did it as well, that would probably get some exposure.
Absolutely.
It's an important message to put out.
Yeah,
You know, if
everything
Creaky
we
would
do
be
on this
willing to do
channel, everything we do on this channel, as well as Jeff and mine's personal channel is Creative Commons. We want this type of message being out there as much as possible. Not so much for the subs on my on these channels, but just because this message is so important. And my final thoughts about this is, guys, if you're willing to defer to the expertise of your mechanic when something's wrong with your car, why wouldn't you defer to the expertise of your doctor or your mental health professional if something is wrong with your body? It makes no sense to me to say that these men and women who have spent years studying medical science and going through years of internships and training, and to say that you know more than they do, to me is completely ridiculous. I'm flabbergasted whenever I hear somebody say that doctors are idiots and they're just indoctrinated in the education system. They are there to help you to maintain your health and your quality of life. That's just silly to think otherwise. So with that, unless anybody else has a couple of more cents they want to throw in, we'll kind of go home and get some breakfast.
You wouldn't ask a checker cab driver to fly the 747 across the Pacific, would you?
Nope.
Good point.
Well, if
Bob,
you don't
I
mind,
heard you wanting to say something. No, go ahead.
if you don't mind, before we cut, I'd like to put a final graph up, just for maybe 5 seconds before we go to the end credits, just as proof that
Go right ahead, Teddy.
vaccinations work.
There's no such thing as too much information.
Fantastic. So I'll let you wrap up. I think Linda was having something to say there.
No, I was just agreeing with logic and with
Reason.
steaming. Mm-hmm.
What are we looking at here?
Let's see.
Polio cases by world region.
What you're looking at is from 1980 to 2016. The bits for the colours kind of peter out about 2000. Polio cases by world region.
Amazing. The power of vaccines.
Yep, proof positive the vaccines work, and I am just amazed at the instances of occurrences in places like Africa and Southeast Asia, according to this graph, where they were in 1980 versus where they are in 2016, and I'm sure that's even less now in 2019. It's amazing. They work. Get them. And anything else is silly. Anybody else got a 2 cents before we go ahead and get some breakfast?
I'm good.
Be sure to tip your servers, folks.
Yeah.
Good idea.
All right.
Give him a super
With
chatter,
that-
too.
Well, with that, Teddy, go ahead and roll them end credits, and we'll go home and get some breakfast.